Okay, guys, so we're picking back up with Unit 5, which is sort of the first half of women's history. Um, the day before this, we were sort of looking at women's history at the beginning of America, right? Colonial women, women in the American Revolution, and then the idea of Republican motherhood. So now moving on, we're getting into the 19th century here, into the 1800s. And I want to start by talking about pioneer women. So, pioneer women, when I say this, I mean women who are moving west, women who live in more agrarian areas, not necessarily the South, but even almost in the Midwestern region, moving into like the Ohio territory, the Indiana territory, those areas. Women there experienced a very difficult life. It's difficult for all involved when you're literally living in the middle of nowhere. I mean, imagine just like camping 24/7. That's pretty much what this is like. But at the same time, you're trying to build a community. You're trying to raise your family. When we look at what these women have left behind, whether it be diaries or letters or things like that, what we see from these women's lives is that they pretty much were concerned with their families, and they were looking for what was best for their children and trying to focus on their family, I guess. There wasn't really much talk of, I don't have a voice in government, or I can't own property, and my financial problems. That wasn't really the focus of women, because that wasn't really what responsibilities that they had been given. They had been given in some ways, equally large, just different responsibilities. And life for women, because of that, was even more difficult than for men, many historians would argue. And that's because not only were women, doing manual labor in fields, working to provide for their families, a lot of farming. There were still plenty of women doing that, but there was also women raising their families, and their bodies are taking a much more physical toll for all this, because not only are they working in gardens and farming and trying to produce crops for their family to live off of, but they're also supervising domestic chores, taking care of their children, cooking dinner, cleaning, and also physically giving birth. That's putting a very serious toll on women's bodies. So we see pioneer women having a much higher mortality rate than men. Life on the frontier was even more dangerous for women than it was for men, because we didn't have any of the knowledge that we have today about medicine, and not necessarily any of the knowledge, but not anywhere close to what we know now about how best to go through childbirth and to protect the mother in that process. So a lot of women on the frontier, unfortunately, led very difficult lives, and many of them died at relatively young ages. Now, at the same time, in the 1800s, when we see our pioneer women toughing it out in the wilderness, we're also seeing women starting to get jobs. If you remember in American History 1, when we talked about industrialization in the 1830s and women starting to work at factories like textile mills and things like that, we started to see women in the workforce really for the first time in the United States, women taking independence for their own finances, which is pretty incredible. But with that comes a backlash as well, and that backlash is called the Cult of Domesticity. So this is a new idea in the mid 1800s, in the middle of the 19th century, about how it was 100% a woman's job to raise her family, and that our country will fall apart and families will collapse if women work, because it is a woman's job to stay home with her kids. The ideal woman is one who stays at home and teaches her children how to be proper citizens. This started with several books that were published, and you see one off here to the side, Goody's Ladies book. And so this was literally like a book of directions, like how you take care of your husband. Always have dinner ready by this time, and always make sure your kids are clean before he sees you, and all of this stuff. And this was very, very popular. So a lot of people were pushing this idea, because we're seeing women start to take on more serious roles in society, and there were people who were freaked out by that, and so they felt like they had to sort of undo it. So what ends up happening is these ideas that it's a woman's job to, not work. And they would publish articles about some women who ended up in mental institutions because they worked and their, brains weren't built for it, and all sorts of crazy stuff. But unfortunately for our ladies, this is going to become pretty widespread. And the women who do work anyway because they have to support their families, or they have to support themselves, a lot of them are really going to be shamed and looked down on by like middle class and upper class America. So, continuing into the mid 1800s, in the 1830s, at the same time that we're seeing a lot of our women starting to work, that is showing our women the problems of society. And at the same time that that's going on, we see the second Great Awakening happen. So if you remember, yesterday we talked about the first Great Awakening, the first major religious revival in the United States. Now we're seeing the second Great Awakening. This one's a little bit different because it's not about, knowing the Bible on your own and investigating your own religious views. That was what the first Great Awakening. This Great Awakening is more about doing good works, and like God has put you on this earth to make it a better place and take care of each other and love each other and show God's light in your community. And so that is going to create the opportunity in the moment for a lot of different reform movements. We are going to see dozens of reform movements in the United States in the mid 1800s, and women are going to be at the helm of every single one. And I mean, women are going to be involved in education. We had women like Catherine Beecher and Mary Lyon, who were starting women's colleges for the first time. We're also going to see women in prison reform, like Dorothea Dix. She had been in education reform, and then was, reading and teaching some prisoners how to read, and saw the horrible state that many of our prisons were in, especially the treatment of people who were mentally ill. And she made it her life's work to develop specific, clinical treatment centers for people with mental illnesses, so that they just weren't lumped into prisons with people who were criminals, like, I've already been murderers and people like that. We don't want our mentally ill people in there with those people. So she worked to get those people the help that they actually needed, instead of just punishing them for something that they couldn't control. We also are going to see women in the temperance movement. The temperance movement is about alcohol. This goes hand in hand with with the second Great Awakening. There's a big movement here to not necessarily ban alcohol, but definitely to push moderation. There's that famous photo of the Women's Temperance Union with a sign that says, lips that touch liquor will not touch ours. And so women were very involved in the temperance movement. We've also got women involved in their own first wave of feminism. This is the first time that we're going to see women really working for the right to vote. And we'll talk about this more later on, but we're going to see the first steps towards getting women the right to vote at the Seneca Falls Convention, which was the first women's rights convention. It was in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. There, they wrote their own declaration where they demanded the right to vote, along with other equal treatment. And many of the women involved in that category of reform were also involved with the largest area of reform, which was the abolition movement, the anti-slavery movement. In fact, Frederick Douglass signed that declaration at the Seneca Falls Convention, but we also know him as a hardcore abolitionist. Women like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote books about the horrors of slavery, like Uncle Tom's Cabin. Women who, like Sojourner Truth, who had been slaves. She gave this, incredible speech called "Ain't I a Woman," where she talked about how she was being treated differently from white women. How, we live in a society that wants to protect women, and she's like, but am I not also a woman? And we don't live in a society that wants to protect me, and that's because I'm a black woman. So that was really important. Women were also very active on the Underground Railroad and helping people escape from slavery. They were in the American Anti-Slavery Society. We've got the Grimke sisters, who were two abolitionists in the South, actually. They were born on a plantation in Georgia, raised, around hundreds of slaves. And then when they were older, dedicated their entire lives to trying to end slavery. When they inherited slaves when their father died, they set them free and then worked to continue to abolish slavery in the South, which is pretty incredible.